thank you for joining us. We're actually here in this new series, this is the kind of the second part of this new series. If you go back to our live stream, you can kind of see the setup that sort of opens up this series. But the series is called Coloring Outside the Lines. And why don't you tell us a little bit about what this series is?
Sure. So basically, we're talking about how we're basing it off the book by Skye Jethani called The Divine Commodity, where he makes or suggests that we live in a consumeristic culture, which is we do. There's no getting around that. And how sometimes the worldview of consumerism has sort of influenced the church.
Yeah.
And how that may not always be a good thing. So we need to sometimes just take a step back, have a look at that, see what we've always kind of done or how things have evolved over time. And just if that's the way we've always done it, then maybe we need to use our imagination and maybe color outside the lines a little bit in order to maybe get back to what Jesus actually intended for his church.
Great. And so we're kind of just diving into just sort of taking sort of what this book, The Divine Commodities, talks about in chapter 2, and the chapter is called the Canvas of Silence. And so, there's a lot of this chapter is really kind of drawing attention how that consumeristic culture really can limit how we see God. Mm-hmm. And so Skye starts the chapter off as sort of like, a story when he was young and sitting with some friends on the beach in Australia and looking at the night sky, and just really how it brought the overwhelmingness of the beauty and the expanse brought him to a place of silence. It was just, again, immense and vastness, and it brings to mind that aspect of God, just how big and vast he truly is. And in that realization, which can kind of be uncomfortable for us, is that the fullness of God truly is incomprehensible.
Yeah. I get that feeling too whenever I go to the ocean.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily looking up at the night sky. I don't stay up that late sometimes. And in summertime, the daylight is quite long. But I know my wife and I like to get up early and watch the sunrise over the ocean. And it's in those moments you just have nothing to say. Yeah. It's just this immense beauty. It's dark and it's kind of chilly and it starts to get light. And then all of a sudden, pop, the sun is like just peeking over the horizon. You get these beautiful colors in the sky, and it just sort of stops all rational thought, and you just kind of soak in the beauty of that. And in that, I think I've never felt so small or yet so connected to God.
Yeah, I have a very similar kind of experience, but mine was like growing up in Saskatchewan, tons of lakes, tons of rivers, but the realization that you can see the shore on the other side. Mm-hmm. And so when I was kind of similar to the ocean, was that realization of like, I can't see the shore on the other side, and it's hundreds, if not thousands of miles away.
Yeah.
And so, there's that bigness and expanse of like, there could be a long way before you hit any kind of piece of land. Or an opposite shore. And so, just in the face of that sort of vastness, that understanding, if you will, it brings, it ought to bring us to a place of silence and a place of awe. And then, like, he is encouraging us to go to that place, even though it can be uncomfortable, because
especially in our culture today, we have very much a distraction culture almost, where you rarely see anybody when they're not talking on their phone or texting or looking at their phone or watching TV or playing a game. And not that there's anything necessarily bad with those. It's just that we're sometimes, I think, get so tuned into that we rarely have times of silence. And if we do have silence, it feels uncomfortable.
Yeah, very much so. And I think we're uncomfortable also in our society with ambiguity.
Yeah.
We like concrete.
We really do.
And so that whole idea that the mystery, the fact that that we, as much as we can know God, we can't really fully know God.
Yeah, and I really like that, is the idea that sometimes we think of God in specific ways, either how we grew up, how we were taught, where we come from, what we read in the Bible ourselves, And we sometimes get to the point where, we think we got God figured out.
Yeah.
Or it comes down to a process, or like you say, that concrete thing that we really like.
Yep.
If we do these 3 steps, this is going to happen. If we follow these 3 steps, we'll become closer to God. And really, God is much bigger than that.
Well, and that's one of the things, like, I can't remember if it was written or just a thought I had. Really, the beginning of truly knowing God is the realization
Yeah.
that you don't and probably
Can't fully know him.
Know God. Yeah, and that's sort of like, hey, you've never known him better. The fact that you know that you really can't know him fully. And this is the birthplace of worship.
Yep.
In that silence and deep awe. So it's really important, I think, that we look at, what can limit how we see God. And really, at the end of the day, it's when we start to see God as a commodity.
Mm-hmm.
So that his value is really only based on how we find him useful.
And not just useful, but useful now in the moment.
Like this moment.
I need God to help me find a parking spot now.
Yeah, and so it's the whole idea that we just talked about, the vastness and just how big he is, and the idea that we then reduce God to simply our context.
Yeah,
you said looking for the parking spot, that kind of idea, and so it's more about God is about formulas. If you do this thing, this will happen. He'll do this. All that clear-cut answers, guarantees of a better life. If we do this thing this way, God will give us this and do this for us. And so there's this very much, I know Skye in another book called With kind of hits on this sort of the idea of like it's really our way of trying to control God.
Yeah, sure.
And that makes, if we're trying to control God, that means like we've missed out just how vast he is. If I just do it this way.
And in our particular faith context, we like to generate a certain feeling about God. If I sing songs a certain way, or I raise my hands, or I do this or I do that, then I'll really feel the presence of God. And again, I think when we get to the point where we're just seeking after the feeling, we've missed the point of God.
Yeah. And then we do, then we're reducing him really simply to what he does for us.
Yeah.
And it's our context. It's just where it is. His value is, and how much, again, how useful he is to us.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you come to the idea of media, and Christian media specifically, it tends to portray God in a way that meets our context.
Yeah.
And so then it scratches that itch or whatever it is, and it just sort of really doubles down on kind of that whole idea of like, oh, his values in the context. Look at all these reasons that are pointing to that. Oh, I must be right. Cool. And so often in these books, they use a really definitive language when it comes to God. And Skye writes, it usually conforms nicely to our personal desire and politics.
Yeah, of course it does. Yeah. And that's interesting because, like you say, in media, it's sort of reinforcing what the context that we prefer.
Absolutely.
And so it comes down to, it's usually portrayed as a personal choice or personal desire. Yeah. And honestly, a lot of our denominations are based around our particular interpretation of how we personally desire the expression of worship or God to be. And two, like you say, or it's aligned with a political agenda.
Yeah. So Skye writes, he says, in a commodity culture, we have been conditioned to believe nothing carries intrinsic value. So basically, nothing's valuable just because it is.
Yeah.
Instead, value is found only in the things useful to us. And he goes on to say this not only applies to God, but it applies to people too. Mm-hmm. That we can just sort of see that, their value is in how you're useful to us.
Yeah.
And again, so that not only limits how we see people. So this is just going down to a really rabbit hole that just keeps getting bigger, deeper. But it limits how we see God in the fact that he's just, we only see him in how he's useful to us.
Yeah.
And then he also writes, commodification has led most people to view God as a device to be used rather than an all-powerful creator to be revered.
Sort of like a genie in a bottle.
Very much.
I rub the bottle or I lift the cap and the genie comes out and grants my 3 wishes because he has to. I'm in control.
Yeah.
I get to choose.
Yeah, and I think if we look at some of the things that can matter to us, and some of those things, I don't want to sit there and say like all of the aspects of God that we can see in this idea are necessarily wrong.
No, I believe God loves us, and he's interested in us personally and corporately as a church, and he wants the best for us. And there are times when he comes across in that way that seems to relate to us in a personal preference kind of way.
Yeah, and I think he does care about our well-being and in our mental health, and he wants to see freedom for captives, and he wants all the marginalized to flourish, and all that sort of stuff. But it becomes when we make some of that stuff definitive and limit it.
We
to
reduce
that.
God, yeah.
Because sometimes I find that in our world, like it's even all the stuff we sort of just talked about, it's sort of like, it seems like there are individuals that sort of like, oh no, it's not all those things, it's just these two things.
Yeah, exactly.
And then there's the other camp, no, it's these two things, and it's sort of like, well, what if it's more,
or all of them,
or a lot of them?
Yeah, I like how A.W. Tozer he kind of illustrated it this way. It's like putting a bucket in the ocean. That bucket is filled with the ocean, even though the bucket is, or the ocean is in the bucket, it's not the entirety of the ocean.
It's not the entirety of the ocean, exactly. And I think that, and that's I think we got to see, it's like as much as we can enjoy those aspects of God, legitimately, and some of them are wrong. Let's maybe not. Because there are some things that we need to rethink. That we have to really be careful with, and to say that it's all right. But when we can value those things, it's just we have to realize this God is so much more than just what we've put in our little bucket.
Yeah, and as we talked about in the live stream last week, sometimes in order for us to overcome this consumeristic influence in the church, we have to consider, in this case, God's vastness that sparks our imagination in order to overcome it.
Yeah, and I really think it was a challenging thing because I had to just really even admit my own issues in this and whatnot. But like with consumer Christianity, we really can reduce God to something that is really not all that awe-inspiring.
No, I agree with you.
And I just like, I think it was that challenge of like, I can do that, and as Skye talks about, one of the unavoidable forces of consumerism is alienation. The idea that the product and its productions are disconnected from our mind. We can do this, so much with people who manufacture things like
our clothes.
They are really people with stories and stuff like that, and it's just sort of like, we just got these clothes. Where do we get? Like there's that disconnection.
Times gone by, you might have bought your clothes locally, where you knew the person that actually made your clothes.
Yeah.
Where now we have no idea who makes our clothes or where they come from most of the time, unless we take the time to bother to check. And most of us don't like doing that because we might not like where they come from.
Well, yeah. Well, and all that, the same can be said of God. I think we've talked about this quite a bit.
Yeah.
Definitely over the years, where like sometimes we can be more interested in the gifts God gives. And even feel like we're entitled to those gifts, and miss that the actual gift is God in of himself, who he is, and not necessarily just what he's done for us. That's a bonus. That's so wonderful.
It is.
And so we need to start to be able to see God from outside of ourselves. Do we see God in the larger story of Scripture, in what it says, and what he says about his own character and attributes, or are we again just kind of focused in our own sort of like, oh, that's how I see him because that's how he's worked in this context here.
And I think the way we do church sometimes often conditions us to do this very thing. We have a certain liturgy or practice, and ours is different from the one down the street. I prefer this one. So then my view of God becomes much narrower, and I'm not awe-inspired by it anymore because I'm just used to it.
Yeah, and I think we didn't do that on a local church level. I think we can do that sometimes with the denominations. So
Yep.
like we do that. But I think a really big thing, I think is a good practice, is to sometimes just get outside even our geographical
Yeah.
kind of thing. Like, 'cause, obviously we're in Canada, and I mean, there's I think a lot of different ways in Canada we can look at God and whatnot, but getting outside of the North American view and being able to see, well, what does a different country that's, especially not westernized,
Yeah.
how do they view certain things of God? And maybe there's some things that, will, I don't know, break God out of the structures that I've created in my own head because I've seen it through with these people in Central America and South America and Africa
Or Korea or something.
yeah, so the South Asia, and just to realize, oh wow, there's an element that you're seeing that I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
That just adds to the vastness of who he is. And
Mm-hmm. I like that.
so I mean, yeah. So even going back to that idea too, Scott McKnight in his book, The King Jesus Gospel, is to kind of on this idea of not keeping. To make sure we're not keeping God into that our own context. He actually takes a lot of time making sure that we see that a good point of the gospel, that good news, was a part of Israel's story,
Yeah.
and that we can't remove it from that to truly understand it in a broader and bigger context. And so it's not just our own. Like it really needs to be saying that, and so we do need to do that. And so again, through our consumer culture, it limits our imaginations of God, and it really it can limit it, to our geographical place, and especially even our time. I mean, it's even great to go back through the history.
Yeah.
Like before, history isn't the last 40 years.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes this is the way it's always been done, and you a little bit 50 years. It's been 50 years.
Or sometimes we treat it like we've arrived now in the past 50 years is the way church is supposed to be done.
Yeah.
And we refuse to learn. But I think in order to move away from that, we need to move to a place of rediscovering the wonder and the immensity of God. So how do we do that?
Well, I think a really great way, and Skye does this really nicely throughout this whole book, especially this chapter. He uses art specifically. He's using Van Gogh in this book, and I think we can use things like nature, because that's the beginning sort of this whole chapter is just him seeing the vastness of the sky,
and even our experience with the ocean.
Yeah, and all of that, because these things can be wonderful and beautiful in saying who God is. It helps us because these things are not necessarily concrete.
Yeah.
Especially art, sometimes the beauty of art is it not concrete, and it's using colors. And I really recommend anyone just to read this chapter for sure. But near the end, when he's talking about that, Van Gogh spent a lot of time trying to really capture what he felt was the immensity the infinity of God by wanting to use a rich blue. And so he put a lot of time thinking will this blue capture that?
Yeah.
And I know we can look at that and be like what's the concrete, that no, he just in his head he just saw this richness of this color.
And that was his interpretation of it as well. So beauty often is in the eyes of the beholder. What I find beautiful, you may not.
Yeah.
And so for him, he was trying to express his art and his appreciation of God with color, and others might do it in a different way.
Yeah, and I think that's where we really do have to see that our words can be helpful, but can never maybe fully grasp the immensity of God. And so sometimes that's where art and nature, yes, it's not going to be concrete, it's not going to be nice and tidy bow, but sometimes it's just okay, I think I get something there, even though I can't put words around it, or just there's not enough. And that does sort of lead us to Isaiah.
Okay, Isaiah 55, 8-9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts.
Again, it's just it's higher.
Yeah.
And that's God speak. And then this is the important thing. We're just what is God saying about himself?
Yeah.
This is Isaiah, writing down what God said,
Mm-hmm.
recording what God says about himself. And so silence allows us the space to contemplate the vastness of the heavens and the God beyond them.
Mm-hmm.
Silence can shatter the trivialized deity that has occupied our imaginations and provide God the canvas to begin a new work in our souls.
So I think I would encourage everybody to take some time this week and do just that. Try and find a place and be quiet. Sometimes it might help to look at a picture from a vacation maybe. I do that often, looking at the sunrise over the ocean. And I can close my eyes and I can put myself right back into that picture. And so I would encourage you just to take a few minutes this week and maybe do that. And if you come up with some ideas about that you can contribute to what we've talked about today, please leave a comment in the comment section there. And if you are part of our church community, to meet with your missional community and the homes that meet around the city during the week and discuss this very idea and what it means to you and what maybe we have learned or can learn from this type of practice. So thanks again for joining us today. And if you like this content, please like and subscribe, and we'll be back with another one soon.